Thank you very much, all of you, for coming back and, again, supporting community. We know that Community Clubhouse is in its infancy, but really, really depends on you. And to that event, we've got like a panel of 5 of probably the people I respect the most in terms of the thing that I, outside of Community Clubhouse, love the most, and that's end-to-end customer support solutions. And it's not just about end-to-end solutions, it's about making it an experience for the player all the way through the solution, and aiming for how do you put excellence in place. And of course, all of us know there's always a person called the CFO. Public enemy number 1, CFO. Everything's got to be done cost efficiently. So how do you put together an end-to-end solution that's cost efficient but still gets that customer satisfaction? And we always forget in that happy agents also make happy players. So what is the end-to-end solution that also looks after the agents? So on that note, if I can bring the panel up, and we'll introduce them, and then we'll kick it off and hand it over to Anna, who is looking after the panel. So we have Anna Wright from Niantic, who's actually, yeah, we go. She's going to be hosting the panel today. Ameliane. Ameliane is a part of the Keywords family and works in player research. If you really want to understand what players do when they play a game, lovely lady to talk to. She'll explain exactly what their arm movements and their hand movements and how it all works together and whether they're enjoying themselves, even if they're smiling or not. André, we always like to say next games, but it's like Netflix. So obviously part of the Netflix family, and André's one of our end-to-end users and really, really great person to work with and understands it as well as Anna, who's also using those systems. Pascal, Rovio, Sega, we're not sure. Rovio, and has done a fantastic job there for a number of years. Again, also building a whole end-to-end system of the process. And then right at the end, last but not least, if you do understand him, you now understand a fantastic accent. We welcome Josh from Stratton Studios, and he'll also give lots of insight in terms of the way these solutions are put together. So take notes. This is going to be really good. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Peter. Hi, everybody. Okay, and just a quick question for organizers. We're going to share this mic. Is that okay? Fab. We're going to do it. That way nobody will speak out of turn. Okay. My name is Anna Wright. I'm the Director of Player Experience and Support at Niantic, and you've got me fresh off of 3 days in New York City where I was at Pokemon Go Fest, and we had about 60,000 players come together to play over the course of 3 days. And I'll tell you, if you ever need an example of how relevant the situational, environmental, behavioral stuff is to a gameplay and to things like support, trust and safety, community moderation, this is a terrific way to get some firsthand experience in that. But I know Peter did a nice intro, but I'm going to let all of the speakers here, who now have their own mics, everybody behave, introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about why they're on this panel. Ameliane?
Hello. This chair is very slippery for some reason, so I'm just going to put my foot here. Hi, I'm Ameliane. I work at Player Research. I've been there very recently. I joined in June of this year. Beforehand, I was working at a game development studio and publisher, and I am a games accessibility lead. So I'm probably going to be the person on this panel who keeps going and accessibility at every question. Yeah, so I work in making sure that we create gaming experiences that meet the needs of players, including players with disabilities, and bringing vision, the developer's vision, to as many people as possible. And yeah, my background is in user research and QA as well, and I moved to games accessibility full-time at the end of 2019.
Awesome. Thank you. A very welcome perspective. Let's hear from André.
Hello. So yeah, I'm André from Next Games. We joined the Netflix family a year ago, and it was more or less the same time I joined the player experience team lead role. Before that, I used to be a player experience. I went to producer role, and then shipped some games out, and then came back to lead the team. I focus on making sure the players get the help they need at the time they need and as quick as they need. And also focus a lot currently on accessibility, so I won't leave you alone there. But yeah, I've been 4 years overall in the game industry.
Awesome. All right, let's hear from Pascal.
Yes, hi everyone. So yeah, hey, I'm Pascal. I've been working for 10 years in the Finnish mobile gaming industry. My tour of duty includes companies like Supercell, Next Games in the past, Sega, well, now Sega, actually, for a couple of days, actually, but Rovio, obviously, joined Rovio 2.5 years ago, overseeing the support operations for, I think it is momentarily 23 titles. So many Angry Bird fans, so many of them. Yeah, I also have a blog, which you might have heard about, the PX Hub. I have been very silent blogging these days, but you can always try to follow. Maybe I will get the motivation again to write.
We forgive you. We're going to give you a little bit of a podium here. All right, Josh.
Hey guys, how you keeping? I'm Josh, I'm the director at Stratton Studios. My background's in A to AAA game development. So Stratton Studios mainly is an engineering outsourcing company. We help game developers solve hard problems that they don't want to solve themselves. Our clients essentially are mostly AAA game devs, and yeah, we've over 150 people at the company at this point in time.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to everybody for being here. Let's dig into the topic a little bit. We're here to talk about player experience, which is a pretty broad and broadly defined kind of topic. I would say one thing we probably all agree on is that anything with regard to the player experience has to start from the player's perspective. But let's get into it. We talk a lot about end-to-end player experience. We talk about how that's relevant not just to things like support, but it also takes into consideration things like community management and trust and safety and content moderation. But let's hear from our panel of experts. Maybe Pascal, since you haven't published a blog recently, you can use this as your opportunity to expound. How do you define end-to-end player experience?
All right, so for me, I would actually say that the player experience encompasses every touch point you have with your player through, well, the whole journey that the player has, from discovery of the brand, discovery of the game, actually going through the funnel, getting into the game, doing that first conversion towards a monetary purchase, and you would think all the way till attrition that they would drop off, but that is not true, because after that you will still have re-engagement, and even if that wouldn't work, you still actually would have to deal with the player's opinion when they are interacting with other players that might interact with your brand. So it's a very, very large journey that you're overseeing. There are so many touch points there.
It's kind of the whole player life cycle, right? Start to finish. I'm interested to hear, does anybody else want to weigh in on how we define player experience? Josh, I'm kind of looking at you, and maybe you can come to us from the perspective of, say, indie developers. It is a very broad topic. We're talking about a lot of touch points, and all those touch points kind of come together to equal a relationship. It's the relationship that our players have, not just with our games, but with the company. How should indie developers think about this? Where should they start?
That's a tricky one. And the reason I say that is every indie game is different and every game development company is different. Ultimately, for me, and what I always suggest to people is, the first point is your compelling gameplay loop. You can't build a player experience without it, and that's your starting point for an indie developer. Because a lot of the time they don't really have the resources internally to start to look at these subsidiary things, and they have to focus on their core gameplay loop first. And then I usually push them to, okay, now let's start to look at your funnel and how you're actually interacting with your players and what that journey is like from start to finish, and then work from there. But really it all stems from the compelling gameplay loop. Without that, you don't have a game.
How do we make sure that at the early stages of development that stakeholders who know a lot about things like support or moderation or accessibility are involved and get to consult on that?
I think this is the really awesome thing about all of the great services that are available today. You've got the likes of 2Hat, Vivox, all these great services that make it easy for indie developers and lower that barrier of entry. You no longer have to hire an external consultant to come in and do it for you. The solutions are there, the documentation is there, the lessons are there to learn, and people are willing to help. That's one thing about kind of, player experience folk, is that they're always willing to lend a hand and give a help. And generally, if you ask a question, you'll get a nice answer. And people will help you. So I think that's the point to start, is look at these services. There's plenty of great ones out there, and really start there for an indie developer, because that's the kicking off point before they start to get into custom engineered solutions.
Can I add something to that? Ooh, hello, okay. No, I 100% agree. I think also in seeking these types of services and communities is really making sure that you're speaking with people who are well connected to the community, because especially if you're a smaller studio or one-person team, or you're making a game yourself, the power of the community is probably one of the richest thing that you can tap into. Still, find ways to reward and remunerate the people you work with, whatever that means. There might be different ways to approach, but 100% in accessibility, it's a very important thing. There's a very popular quote called "Nothing about us without us," often used when it comes to disability-related conversations, but it applies to everything, really. So, yeah.
Yeah, Ameliane and I were talking a little bit beforehand, and one of the questions, it's really easy to talk about this stuff and kind of stay in the clouds and stay really theoretical about it. We all believe that these functions are necessary because they can positively impact the bottom line. But how do we start to demonstrate that? How do we put that practice into action? And you had, I think, some pretty good perspective on maybe starting small and being reasonable. Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of your early wins?
Yeah, so I'm speaking from an accessibility perspective, right? But I think a lot of it can be applied to just UX in general. Identifying the high impact, low hanging fruits is probably one of the best way to start, because then you can build from there and do better as time goes on, as you release more titles. And this also ensures that you're not overwhelming yourself with kind of like a grocery list of 150 things that you want to do. Because the second you do that, there's a couple of different risks that you run. You run the risk of burning yourself out. You run the risk of potentially hurting your credibility by demanding your leadership or the people that invest money in your project with, unrealistic, scope. So it's very important to establish a scope. Even when it comes to accessibility, sometimes people are kind of scared to talk about this because it's a field where everyone is important and everything is yet to be done. So it feels like everything we're unable to do feels like a failure because it's so important. But the thing is that consistent progress, little steps, consistent progress over time will be way more efficient in including more players and making inclusive experiences than trying to do everything all at once and hitting a wall and not being able to do anything because you weren't able to get the money for it, or you weren't able to do it because of technical limitations or whatever. So yeah, identifying some key things that you can commit to is going to mean the world to your community. It's going to, be easier to work with your team, to meet them where they are, because everyone has a different reality. So yeah.
I appreciate that. I actually am going to turn the mic on André right now. We were chatting a little bit before, too, and André leads player experience. And how big is your team, André?
3, include me.
And what's your scope? Can you tell us about what you all oversee?
So yeah, we have our internal games, which are in the works. We have player experience, which means support, community management, social media, and trust and safety.
Okay, so that's a lot. I was telling André that I have a colleague who says if you don't have a trust and safety function at your company, there is very likely somebody performing that function. So find out who they are and maybe see if they need a hand. But maybe you can tell us how your team, organizes itself from a player experience perspective. How do you prioritize your efforts? What's important?
We try to align a lot with what the game is like having as a goal for a certain quarter. If they are tending to, okay, we got to improve retention, how can we help as a team? Can we go through user feedback? Can we search through the support tickets? Is there a certain range of tickets coming in from the early players that are reporting certain issues that we were not aware? Because one thing we tend to say is that QA will always test your game, but it will test your game as a developer. So testing the game with the players, taking their feedback early on, will help you get better. So what we do then, okay, retention, okay, let's try to reach out to the new players. Let's try to have social media posts about it. Let's be clear in the communications when we announce a new update. Okay, our focus is in retention, and we have done these changes. We have had a lot of players reinstalling the game so they could play it, and then we got later on like, hey, please re-add this feature for us as well. So we always got to organize ourselves and prioritize based on the teams. Of course, we are small. Currently, we have 2 player experience experienced members on one game, and that does help to prioritize multiple things at the same time and take bigger projects. But we should always take into the reality check: can we really achieve it this quarter? That we need to postpone it. So one thing that matters a lot with the team is that even when you go to growth plan, think it as not what you are doing only, but think it as what the goal of the team is, and prioritize it based on that always. You are still going to take learnings and checkpoints of that learnings. That checkpoint can be basically the goal of the team. So as a tree, you do have to be very flexible and very, let's say, not get offended if things get canceled, because they do get canceled quite a lot.
Yeah, we can't get too emotionally attached in this industry. You said a couple of things that I think are worth hitting on again. The first is you've always got to be paying attention to your company's broader goals, because there are definitely ways that teams within player experience can contribute to those goals. But you're also talking a lot about the feedback loop, which is sort of, our first conversation was about the player. How do we center our work around the player? But we're a pretty critical partner internally. Can somebody talk to us a little bit about what that feedback loop looks like and how critical that is? Maybe how you've been effective with that.
Yeah, so we started the project which is early access. So we have players with NDA agreements that have access to the features early on. We do try to give these very early on when we are still developing them, because then we can get the point of view of accessibility. Is these visible enough? Or in terms of, okay, this tutorial is too messy. We have no idea what is it about. So when we come to user feedback, it's not just about sending them surveys. It's also taking them early on with the right timing. Because if you have a feedback form after the feature is out, most likely it will never get touched again. So it's the timing that's also very important with the feedback.
Really quickly to kind of pile onto that, because I agree 100%. Research is key, and especially if you're able to get that research as early as possible, you can make sure that those results and the feedback that you get sort of becomes then part of your vision and part of your DNA as a project. Because if you get that feedback super later on in production, thanks for the info, but retroactively trying to fix the different issues that arises is a whole can of worms and can be way more expensive than if you were able to get early, input from the community, and making sure that the design that you're already making and the intentions that you're already going through for your game take in consideration these things. So
I think that's great. I mean, you're hitting on this idea of soliciting feedback, going directly to the players and asking them. But we all also know that we're going to get a lot of unsolicited feedback in places that maybe are not official channels. Pascal, can you talk to us a little bit about that type?
Yeah, so you always have people that will use different kind of channels in order to get your attention, and that is perfectly fine, because to players it doesn't matter. They just want to talk to the brand, they want to talk to the developers. So don't silo your players, that's what I would say actually. Just make sure that everything is integrated. We have a lot of people that are actually commenting on Discord, our own Discord actually, bringing up a lot of feedback. That is gathered, that is filtered, because not everything is actionable, obviously. But it's a perfect place to actually gather some feedback from people who actually are really vested within your game. Reviews, also very interesting kind of part to actually look what's going on with your game and what the health of your community is like. And your support tickets, obviously, it should be the main thing. Although, however, I do feel that we are sometimes lacking to look at DSAT when we're looking at scores. DSAT is such a big giveaway on what actually might be going wrong with your game at that time, or what players might feel dissatisfied with. So yeah, I would say look at DSAT, definitely.
I think that's such a great tip, and it's something that we think about a lot, which is originally our customer satisfaction survey was very hyper-focused on the support interaction, because we wanted to know what attributes of that interaction we could work on. But we realized we were kind of limiting the type of DSAT info we could get about the broader game. Josh, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest things we've found across the various different projects that we've worked across is, especially when it comes to gathering feedback from the players, if it's boring, players won't do it, because players are motivated. They want to play a game, they don't want to fill out a form. So one thing we found very successful is to gamify our feedback forms. Gamify them, integrate them into the game. Why can't it be an NPC in the game that's gathering the details, especially in MMO-style projects? Works really well. The actual rates, success rates and submission rates rocket through the roof, and it doesn't remove the player from the actual play experience that they're enjoying. Because the last thing you want to do is someone's just after finishing a quest, slaying the dragon, and then next minute a feedback form pops up and saying, do you enjoy the game? It just ruins the experience. So if you can integrate it into the gameplay loop where it doesn't feel intrusive, it rockets up the submission rates, and you're actually going to get a more honest feedback from the player. So we found that very successful.
I love that. That's great. Let's get into the details a little bit for folks. Let's talk a little bit about some of the strategies you all have employed, or some of the ways that you have focused on and organized efforts to make improvements to the player experience. I'm going to volley this one to the first one who raises their mic. Pascal.
All right, so I have a really cool story related to this, and this goes back to my time at Next Games. So we were kind of struggling a little bit with actually having a more open or tolerant culture towards player opinions at that time. And, well, that resulted in a lack of resourcing, which is most likely not something you're unfamiliar with. So one of the things that we actually did was we set up a shadowing project within player support. And we didn't make it mandatory, but we approached top management in the company first to actually spend a couple hours for a couple of days within the player support team doing the things that we do. Answering tickets, looking at our tools, recovering accounts, dealing with toxic players. It blew their minds. And they started like getting people more involved, telling people like, hey, you really should be doing this. You should be talking to these players. Yes, there are some people that you don't want to deal with on a daily basis. That's fine, but these are our players, and they are talking to us like that because they're feeling emotional about something, and that comes from passion for the game. So what we actually did with that is that we actually made a couple of really good improvements out of that. We increased, I'm not technical, so I can't explain what kind of hocus pocus magic is behind it, but our admin console for recovering accounts, it had a loading time of 7.8 seconds per player, and one of our backend engineers, he thought that there was no excuse for that being that slow. So they changed something on the backend, again, I don't know the magic behind it, and all of a sudden, our admin console loaded up per player in 1 second. So that means 6-point-something seconds we had saved for every time an agent actually needed to open up a player profile, which increases productivity overall. Another thing that we actually figured out was that more than 30% of the player questions that we got were, how do I recover my account? I lost my game. I updated the game on Google Play, and all of a sudden I have this new game and all my purchases are gone. Well, we had a UX designer who said like, okay, well, it looks like we have to do something with the flow, the UX flow for saving your game. And we put something in place on the UX side for our games, and all of a sudden we saw a drop from more than 30% to under 20% of the amount of people that were losing their game, or that at least that were writing to us about losing their game. But generally people would write if they lose their game. To give a little bit of numbers on how this actually did work, so we split it up into 3 courses, or 3 shadow courses we called it. The first one was 3 hours for 3 days, and then you get a certificate. We gamified this with stickers and a certificate, actually.
3 hours at one time.
Yeah, and then for 3 days. Then you could do another 3 days, and you could get more stickers and a better certificate. And then you could get the ultimate if you came back for another 3 times 3 hours. So we had a total participation rate within the company of 63%, if I'm not mistaken. That's for a company that was over 120 people, so that's actually pretty good. They all graduated, the 62% graduated the first series. For the second series, it was way less. It was 20%, something like that. And we only had, for the third one, we actually had 2 people in the whole company that actually did want to come back. And they were actually hoping that there was yet another cycle that they could go through because they loved it so much. But that, I would say, that had created a shift within the mentality of the development culture within the company at that point.
That's incredible, and I think what's really great about that example is that you're demonstrating not just internal efficiency gains, right? You're talking about tooling improvements that shorten the total time your agents are having to spend on each case. That's dollars, but on the flip side, you're making it way easier for players to get into the game. You highlighted a problem that the game team itself could start to design around. That's where I think player experience gets really exciting and where it's completely undervalued. Any other stories? Yes, Ameliane.
Yeah, so again, speaking more from the accessibility perspective, something that works really well is just doing empathy building workshops, bringing in the players that we're trying to, reach and speaking directly to the developers. It's easy to sort of dismiss accessibility when you just look at it as kind of like this weird, unit that doesn't have a face, but when you have players coming directly to you saying, hey, I would love to play your game, but I can't because, you don't have mappable controls or you don't have closed captions, and I can't play it. I wish I could. I wish I could buy your game. I wish I could encourage you, but I can't. So that really, really helps. We also have encouraged people internally to speak up on their needs. We've organized internal playtests with a focus on accessibility. So, for example, we did colorblindness-focused accessibility playtest where we had about a dozen employees with colorblindness who tested the game and brought feedback. And then we also had, for example, kind of like as a not even something we aimed to do, but we had someone who also had tinnitus who gave us feedback on specific part of the game that really triggered their tinnitus really, really bad. And they worked on the game, which was really annoying because they were like, every time I need to work on that part, I just like, I have to mute the entire game. And so we ended up going to the audio team and being like, is there something we could do? And this was this took about a day of work, and they made a focus mix mode, which basically prioritized the audio in the game in such a way that only the crucial information was prioritized and the rest was really muted down. And this fit really well, with their system already because the sound were categorized, they had priorities already, and that worked really well. Another thing that we find also help is identifying what we already have. And what the team already has done, and how can we expose that to the player. A good example is developer or QA debug commands that oftentimes are being used to make working on the game less painful. Sometimes that could be modifying damage intake, damage output, moving faster, making the game go quicker. This is sometimes that's a feature that's used for marketing teams to be able to do trailers that go faster or slower. And sometimes we can find that, is there any of that we can actually expose to the player? We've already done it, we just need to make it pretty and put a bow on it, And so those are quick wins that we can identify, and making sure that also we approach this as early as possible in design to even prevent some of those barriers to be implemented in the first place. With the example of colorblindness, I'm a huge fan of making sure that your experience is colorblind friendly by design. So, you're already going to be making a user interface. It's not an extra, resource or budget to make your user interface colorblind friendly. So there's a lot of wins like that you can identify that actually don't add to your budget, or the resources that you need to make your experience more inclusive. So making sure that you identify those with your team and see what they've already done to celebrate that is really important.
Yeah, I think that's great. And one other thing, Ameliane, that we were talking about earlier is some of the ripple effects of investing in things like accessibility. You might have players who maybe don't identify as having accessible needs, but you were telling me about, maybe you can share with them about some of the features that have ended up being extremely relevant for all players.
Yeah, so there's a concept, if ever you want to I'm giving you some homework. If you want to research on the curb cut effect, that's an accessibility concept that we talk about a lot. Curb cuts being the curb cuts that we see, in sidewalks in most cities. This was originally made to accommodate disabled war veterans, but this is now something that we all benefit from and that we all use, whether you're someone who has, a grocery cart, or you have to move furniture, or you're, a parent walking with your stroller. These are all things that we benefit from and that we could sort of even take for granted now, but that initially were made for accessibility in mind. And something that we discovered was, for example, when we launched a game that I worked on called Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. We had subtitles turned on by default, and I think it was 97% of people left them on. So that can also be very useful data. So if you work with metrics team, data analytics team, make sure that accessibility-related settings are being gathered in metrics, because you can really discover some really interesting things. Also, to make your first boot flow more, smooth, accessibility can be kind of worms sometimes. So you're like, okay, what do I expose to the player when they launch the game, versus what do I leave in the menu that they go discover for themselves? In that, specific scenario, we were like, okay, well, if 97% of people leave subtitles on, maybe it's not that big of a pain to, leave it for those who want to opt out to go look into it for themselves. So yeah, these are just some examples. But
yeah, I think that's great. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about our players, the audience. How do we decide, or I'd like to hear from some of you, how do you decide how you organize your efforts? If you're a really small team supporting maybe small games, or if you're a really small team supporting big games, how does scale factor into that? So you've got multiple channels, people writing in through support. Maybe we start with the support example and then we can get into community, but how do you prioritize responses, and how do you be smart about that? Go ahead, André.
Yeah, so our approach tends to be ahead of the curve and be as efficient as you can be. So there's a lot of these noise tickets, which is just going to be the basic FAQ could answer. But players do not go after the FAQs if they can skip it. So what you can do is that you can use bots and automations to phrase these answers that do not look like a bot. They are a bot, you know it, but player doesn't really see it, that it's a bot. Make the flow as seamless as possible so you can handle all the tickets that pass that automation. We have very high automation. Samantha can correct me, but I'm pretty sure we have very, very high automation. We are close to the 90s for fully and manually percentage of automated. So when it comes to player support, just look what you can automate without negatively affecting the player. And keep implementing and improving these, because they will lose their value over time as the game is developing. Then if you go to forums, Discord, Reddit, try to integrate them in a way that you are in one platform. It doesn't mean you're going to be, if you're on Discord, we have Reddit, I'm not going to be there. No, let the Reddit be managed by community moderators that you trust, and let the feedback flow to you. You do not need to be the front line. You can have very trustable players giving you the feedback and be the front line to you. We say our moderators are just our meat shields. They will protect us no matter what, and we will try to thank them as much as we can. And then for social media, yeah, it's a lot for one team for the big games. But it takes time to have a good strategy. So try to do the trade-offs and see what you can prioritize and what is the low-hanging fruit that was brought up that you can win with the players. And as soon as you have the trust with them, it will become easier over time.
And if I can add on to that, you can also be very proactive in trying to get insight, not just from your active players or your sort of core audience, but also understanding if people are not engaging with your game or your products, understanding why they might not be. That's something in research that we do often is identifying people who would technically be an audience that we target for, but we notice that they don't engage with what we've presented to them. So understanding why that is. So kind of connecting with detractors in a way that can be healthy for everyone involved. It's something to be careful about because, of course, there's trolls and things like that. But there are beneficial ways that you can strategize for to engage with those people and understand perhaps why they're not active parts of your communities.
Ameliane, do you need a research team to do that kind of thing?
Yes. It's mainly just because, of course, there's the expertise thing in the sense that, the research team will know how to engage with those people, also know how to ask questions that aren't going to be leading, because sometimes when you kind of act as the front line, especially if you're an indie developer, of course, you wear many hats, so it can be difficult to say, like, yeah, just use your research team. You might not have one, to be fair, but make sure that you do your research yourself if you have no means to have a user research team, to make sure that you conduct these processes in a way that will be beneficial for you and for the player base, because there's a lot of mistakes that you can do when doing these types of research without much experience, which can lead into kind of not really usable or actionable data or feedback. You want what you work on to be actionable, so that's a very key part of this.
So let's dig into that a little bit, and let's say you don't have the benefit of a research team that you get to rely on for this kind of thing, but you are sitting on, say, a support environment and a community environment that has a ton of data. Josh, can you talk to us about how you get to know your players through some of these data?
One of the interesting things that I've always found about game developers is they're hoarders. They always like to hoard a lot of data. And even the smallest of indie developers have data. One of the greatest things over the last 2 years, in my opinion, that's came to games is the use of natural language models and a variety of different other, everyone's heard of ChatGPT, different, AI models that can be used to empower your, what I like to call your community care stack. And you really can harness that data to create and really get an insight into what your players are doing, why they're doing it, and when they are doing it. And by doing that and then feeding that data into natural language models, you can then, empower your community care team with that data at their fingertips. And they can then browse through it, and they don't need to, search through database or anything. It's right there, see what it spits out. If it's good, and go with it. If it's not, they can just tweak it a little bit. And we've seen anywhere from 60 to 70% productivity improvements when implementing models like that. And it's not that expensive to do, which is the great thing. A lot of it's all open source technology, and all you need is one machine to run it, and you're pretty good to go.
One machine and maybe one engineer to help you get it going?
Yes.
Yeah. Pascal, anything to add on this?
Well, we have a research team, so we use that
that's
one.
great.
But then in addition to that, it's a combination of different data endpoints that you actually gather. We use qualitative feedback from player support. We use quantitative feedback from looking at the metrics. And then we have the research team that actually either says yes or no, this is bullshit, don't believe that, because that sometimes happens as well. So it's just a combination of all those kind of things. We have to be careful as well that we are just not following the data purely, but that we are just being informed by the data, because that doesn't necessarily reflect the truth of what actually is going on. Because everyone can have this thing of yeah, but we can see that 80% of the users are interacting with this feature, so it has to be good. Well, of course, if you don't give the user a choice of not interacting with the feature, it doesn't lead to the same conclusion. So always keep that in mind.
Ameliane is nodding heavily. Let's hear.
Yeah, I agree. I love data. However, data without context can be sort of dangerous. So, a quick example would be, we did years ago just a playtest, and we noticed that players were getting stuck in an area for a long time. And, by observation, we knew that people were not stuck. They were heavily enjoying an exploration area that they were appreciating, and they weren't stuck. They were just walking around and enjoying themselves. And when the data analytics team came back with the data, they sort of, I don't remember the number, but it was X amount of people stayed stuck in this area, but we worked with the data analytics team pretty closely, so we knew we were like, we observed the player, we talked to the players, and people actually heavily enjoyed their time in that area. And so that way we were able to provide a report that was not faulty, if that makes sense, because then the developer were like, would have assumed like, oh no, there's something wrong here when there wasn't really,
Oh, that's a great example. All right, audience, if you're kind of dozing from lunch, wake up now. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I'm going to turn it over to you for questions. But first, I'm going to ask the team. I want to hear. We're a team now. I don't know if you knew that. I just made that happen. I want to hear from each of you. What do you think is the most overlooked aspect of player experience? Let's start with you, Ameliane.
Accessibility. So the thing is that with accessibility, we hear a lot these days about DEI conversations, so diversity, equity, inclusion, but there's kind of an A missing in here oftentimes. I've attended a lot of events on diversity, inclusion, all of that, but accessibility is oftentimes sort of left aside, and it shouldn't be. Disability is one of the biggest minorities because it's so intersectional. Anybody can be disabled. And if you are not identifying as, disabled yet, you can be in the future. It's something like that. And we're all getting older. The gaming community was not what it was years ago. Our grandparents, our parents were not necessarily people who grew up with games, and so we don't see a lot of, elderly communities being gamers. There are exceptions, of course, but as a majority, it's not really the case. But it will be the case because I don't know who here plans on stopping to play video games once they hit 65, but I don't, So even if, you want to put aside it's good for the world, it's leaving money on the table if you don't, and, bringing your vision to a wider audience, if you want to keep it selfish, make it for yourself, future-proof your experiences, make sure that you're able to create an industry and push for an industry that, takes care of all its audiences, because disabled players are not a separate audience, they're part of the audiences you're trying to reach. And if I might steal a quote from Billy Gregory, because we're speaking a lot about UX today and things like that, he said some things which I think is really clever. He said, if you're doing UX for only some users, it's called SUX, and it sucks.
Hey.
Heyo. So, yeah, that's it.
All right.
Me.
Andre, let's hear from you. Overlooked
Yeah, I was going to
aspects.
say accessibility as well, because you can expand the player base you have currently. Everybody's a player, no matter if they have disabilities or not. And like even if you have some easier to control or colorblind options, you are leaving that option not just for people with disabilities, but also for anyone that might have but haven't recognized, and might be they actually like to have certain colorblind color on. I have not a disability, but I actually like to play, for example, World of Warships with a colorblind option, just because it just looks cooler, but I don't have a visibility, right? So I think accessibility for games is overlooked a lot of time. We don't think about the big market that's out there, that anyone can benefit. You can be, if you do it well, you can be the key example in the gaming industry, and you can use that for even more games and bigger player bases.
Absolutely. No player left behind. All right, Pascal.
Well, I'm going to say player safety. And I know it's kind of a very wide kind of concept, because to me at least player safety is not just about the kind of toxic dribble that you can see in chat or in usernames, but it's also data protection. Is going to become such a massive thing over the next few years. I mean, it's already happening everywhere now. Like, I know that we at Rovio, we are trying to get very prepared about that, especially because we also have a lot of younger players, as you might expect. Yeah, but I think player safety is still, it's getting more attention, but it's still being overlooked, because how many times have you talked to someone from a different gaming studio that said like, oh cool, are you going to have chat in your game? Does it mean that you're having moderation in there? No, why would we need to? Like, what could possibly go wrong there? So, I mean, I've seen developers like letting players upload profile pictures. You do not want to be in that situation. I do not want to moderate that. But yeah, privacy, it's ever changing, so
Yeah.
I think that is going to need to be something that we all are going to be talking to each other about.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, with a location-based game like Pokemon Go, too, we're talking about physical safety in ways that get really complex but are really critical. Josh.
I have an interesting take on this. And the one piece that I think gets overlooked is the developer experience. And the reason I say that is because if empowered communities are a driving force, they're a powerful force, and I don't feel that that force is redirected enough at the developers to empower them to do better. There is nothing better than when a team is fueled by the community and gets that good feedback from the community and is pumped and comes into work every day saying, yes, I'm making something that matters and something that people are enjoying every day. There's nothing worse in a development environment than an unhappy team that thinks their player base hates them. It really isn't. And the amount of good things that can come out of that by redirecting that force in a positive way is unbelievable. And that's the one thing I think people don't talk about enough, because it gives downstream impact, which can cascade multiples.
I think that's a great point. The overlooked developer. All right, we're going to turn it over to y'all for questions, and it looks like Oscar's going to help me. The man in the hat.
We have a few questions. Ooh. We have a few questions that came on the Google form, so I'm going to come around the back so I'm not in the way of everybody. I'm going to actually ask particularly one, which I think came from ChrisGab at gmail.com. I don't know who ChrisGab is, but that's the name we've got. There you go. We were talking over lunch. And the question is, and it applies to me to a certain extent because I've only really recently identified that I'm probably ADHD myself. My son is ADHD. My wife, age 58, got diagnosed with ASD. So this is something we're becoming much more aware of. What accessibility thoughts do we include in our planning for support to handle how we respond to people with neurodiversity needs? And I'd be interested to know what you all think about that.
Very good question. Cognitive accessibility is a part. Cognitive and mental health, actually, I'll add to that. Accessibility is oftentimes overlooked, and inaccessibility, cognitive and mental health, is oftentimes overlooked because. Like he said, there's a lot of people who have ADHD, are on the autism spectrum, and this is a very, very large population that we're potentially leaving aside or harming even with our experiences without knowing about it. Something that really helps is finding ways that you can reduce cognitive load. A lot of people experience sensitivity overload, whether it's with audio or visual, and with the focus mix thing that I talked about earlier that was initially really implemented for one of our developers who gave feedback about tinnitus, we actually noticed that a lot of players who came with feedback were people with cognitive disabilities who really, really enjoyed that feature because it allowed them to play the game, which is it's a superhero game. It's in space. It's very a lot, And having that feature in there helped them to play in a more relaxed way, and all of that. Difficulty settings. That's a can of worm in itself. Could be an entire panel in itself. But yeah, difficulty settings can also help because especially if you have customization available within those settings. For example, with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we had done layered difficulty system. So we had difficulty that you could modify for puzzles, exploration, and combat. So that way, if you were someone who were like, hey, I hate combat, I don't want to experience that, you could put that all the way down. And if you were like, actually, I love to bang my head against the wall against puzzle, you can also put that all the way up, So these are some examples, of course. We've also noticed that people with ADHD also highly benefited from subtitles and closed captions because a lot of them would either play on muted or really low volume, and that was really helpful. And also cognitively being able to understand language and all of that. So some examples.
I think that's great. And I can say on the support side, one thing that we've done is just set up a specific feedback loop for inquiries or feedback that we get from our players who have this kind of experience. And we try to make sure that, thank thank you, Oscar, that we have a direct line to that feedback to our developers, that it is organized and synthesized specifically for that audience, to the audience who can make a difference about it. All right, next question.
Can I just add a little bit to that? So one of the things that I think is also important in game design as well is, and one of the sort of side things about being ADHD is you can often have dyspraxia, and also dyslexia and various other conditions that can also be common amongst people with those kind of neurodivergent elements. For me, I can't play platform games because I cannot keep up the accuracy required to the standard of a designer of those games. I physically can't do it, literally physically can't do it. So I'm unable to pursue. In fact, even like Assassin's Creed 2 had these runs where you had to exactly match the particular timing to get across the rooftops, or you lost the entire track of half the story.
Yeah, the QTEs are a big problem oftentimes. Yeah, that's a good point.
And honestly, just give me another option, or just be a bit more generous in the timing. Anyway, sorry, I'm just sorry. Did you want to? Yes. Another question that was asked. This one is from Giorgio Dusso. Giorgio, are you? Yep. Thank you. So the question here is. A what-if scenario, you're launching a closed beta, you didn't prepare either a good enough feedback based on feature acquisition or a feedback form, so you don't see why people don't come back to a session. How do you decode why no one's responding to you? How do you, if you've gone your beta out there, but you haven't got enough data, how do you recover the lost information?
Yeah, that's pretty difficult one, I would say. So like, you can always extend it, but that's not the right way to do it. What you can do is like, try to promote it as you go, because you don't think it as a beginning, you announce it, and then and that's it, it's out. Keep posting it, keep sharing it, keep making sure the players are interested on it. If they are not interested because either it's broken, that's why nobody wants to play with it, or then the feedback itself is not there. Like they don't know how to give you feedback because it comes against accessibility. We had cases where we used the Google form. That was awful. They had no idea what they were doing because they didn't want to give their emails, understandable. But then we also didn't want to get trolls in, also understandable from our side because we have to analyze the data. So what we did was like we have Discord channels where the players can go, join, and share their comments. But not everybody wants to be on Discord, so social media post, ask about the feedback, ask what they are thinking, and go through the comments. Like, don't see things as one, be proactive and try to be problem-solving, like a perspective. Like if something is not working, just keep trying and keep looking why it's not working. Because yeah, we had a lot of those. Players didn't care, or player had an NDA, but then decided to share everything to the player base. That can happen. And that can, you have to manage then the expectations. So just keep trying and be very detailed as possible on any feedback is good.
Yeah, a quick thing that I want to add to that is make sure that you're actually using the right channels to approach your players, because you might not understand where your player base actually is at that point. If you're thinking, yeah, but we're going to have this big strategy, Discord, this, blah, 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 and all of a sudden your target audience is on Facebook, well, that will not give you the results.
That's a great point. All right, Oscar, we got any others?
We do. We have another fun one. This is from Nuno. Where's Nuno? Yeah, you've been great. You keep posting questions. Be more Nuno. So someone trying to start to develop UX research habits at a small company. For somebody who's doing that. What will be the low-hanging fruits for you? I have thoughts myself, but if you're going to try and develop UX research habits, what would you suggest?
I'm looking at Ameliane.
Well, I'm looking at the others because I feel like I talked a lot. So do you want to jump on that?
That's an interesting one. And the reason I say that is, if you're starting from scratch, first you have to become informed, because there's no point trying to stab in the dark, just Googling things and seeing where you go. I think really it's a matter of figuring out where your company's standard operating procedures are currently and what's going to fit in easily there. Like if you already have a Discord community set up, well, let's look at building strategies around that first. Don't try and go and do all other crazy stuff. If you've nothing set up at all, well then maybe try and collect feedback in game, gamify it a little bit, you know. Really start small, and then you can build your research habits from there, and then kind of slowly build on your standard operating procedures on what you're going to do next time. Like, okay, maybe next time we're going to do X, Y, and Z. But don't just look on the internet and say, okay, well, this is what everyone else is doing. Figure out what's going to be doable for you and repeatable. Because there's no point doing something once. You need to do it consistently for it to pay off and for it to work. Because one data set, you can't trust it. You need lots of data to be able to make an actionable decision.
That seemed like a pretty strong answer. I would say the repeatability is really critical, right? You want to develop that baseline. You want to figure out what your baseline is, and it might be different for everybody. And one data point's not going to tell you that. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to add on to that, sometimes I feel, especially early, if you're in conception, it can be sort of a thing where people tend to be like, we're going to do a game that does everything and that everyone will play. But that's not very realistic. And even if you're struggling to get your vision focused, you can start research at that point too. You know, we've done research on paper, you know, like just to help us, you know, focus our vision and our pillars, and also understanding what the players expect and want, and then from there, you know, kind of like you said, you know, like repeating that process as you go through different milestones and different checkpoints to either validate or change directions. So yeah, there's really, you can't start like too early. I really feel like it. It's not to say that, you know, you have to make hard decisions, you know, if you're in preconceptions at that point, but it can just help you focus on the right stuff and prioritize, and, you know, help you get less overwhelmed too.
Yeah. Y'all, we are 2 minutes away from end of the hour, but Oscar's going to chime in.
I can't help but want to chime in on that. So I am a massive fan of doing, you know, in-person testing done in the right way, as long as you know what question you're asking. But I'm also a massive fan of getting game in front of real people without any influence of me whatsoever as quickly as possible. That also has its risks, because basically you're asking a lot of people to try something that's not finished. And that can be in itself biasing the outcome of your results. So the biggest problem is not necessarily the particular techniques, it's knowing what question it is you're doing, what question you're actually trying to answer, and what is the best way to answer that question without influencing the outcome. Because it's so easy to prime people without realizing it, and that's what destroys the research.
I'll say totally to that, and then I will thank you all for attending. You know, I think one thing that if I could leave you with anything, you've heard us talking about data science, you've heard us talking about research. A good player experience program is a coalition of folks from around your company who care about the way your players are interacting with your product, who care about the situations and environments that product is used. Find that coalition, build on it, work together, and you can start to make some really, really meaningful improvements for the folks who play your games. Thank you.